The leather chairs in Harrison and Thompson's main conference room cost more than my first car. I sat in one now, taking notes as managing partner Richard Thompson II held court at the annual strategy meeting. Every stroke of my pen was deliberate, measured, just like everything else I did at this prestigious law firm. Our merger and acquisitions division has secured the Chen-Goldman deal, Thompson announced, his voice carrying that distinctive tone of old money and Harvard law. $50 million, gentlemen. Our biggest international merger this year. The other partners murmured appreciatively, their Italian suits rustling as they shifted in their seats. I continued taking notes, my face carefully neutral. I'd spent the last 6 months quietly laying the groundwork for this deal, making connections, reviewing international trade laws, finding the loopholes that would make this merger possible. Not that anyone in this room knew that. To them, I was just Elena Martinez, the quiet paralegal who kept the files organized and brought coffee to meetings, the one who stayed late every night, who knew every case file by heart, who had an uncanny ability to find precedents that others missed. We'll need our best people on this, Thompson continued, his eyes sweeping the room before landing on James Preston, a third-year associate fresh from Yale Law. Preston, you'll take point on this one. I felt my pen pause fractionally on the paper. Preston had never handled an international merger. His experience was limited to domestic acquisitions, and even those had required substantial cleanup from other attorneys. Sir, I said quietly, speaking for the first time in the meeting. The Chen-Goldman merger involves complex international trade laws, particularly regarding technology transfer between. Thompson's laugh cut me off. It wasn't a kind sound. Elena dear, he said, his smile dripping with condescension. Stick to filing, would you? Leave the real legal work to qualified attorneys. The room filled with chuckles. Preston smirked, already imagining his name on the deal that could make his career. I returned to my notes, my face betraying nothing. None of them knew about the other life I'd built, the one I kept carefully hidden behind my paralegal facade. They didn't know about the nights I spent teaching advanced international law as an adjunct professor at Columbia Law School, or about the papers I'd published under a different name. They had no idea that Elena Martinez, their quiet paralegal, was also Professor Anne Blackwood, the author of the definitive text on international merger law. It had started as a necessity. After my father's stroke 5 years ago, I needed a steady income to help with his medical bills. Teaching paid well, but the schedule was irregular. Working as a paralegal provided stable income and, more importantly, access to real-world cases that enhanced my academic work. I published under my mother's maiden name to keep the worlds separate, never expecting the arrangement to last this long. But something about the anonymity became addictive. In the academic world, I was a rising star. My papers cited in major cases, my opinions sought by top firms. At Harrison and Thompson, I was invisible, which allowed me to observe, to learn, to understand how theory translated into practice. I stayed late that night, reviewing the Chen-Goldman files one more time. The merger was more complex than Thompson realized. The Chinese technology export restrictions alone would require careful navigation, and that was before considering the intellectual property implications. Still here, Elena? Preston's voice carried from the doorway. He'd loosened his tie, probably after celebrating his new assignment at the partners' bar across the street. Just organizing the files for you, Mr. Preston, I said, sliding a stack of papers into a folder. He walked over, cologne heavy in the air. You know, you could be more than just a paralegal if you applied yourself. Night school, maybe? Although, he chuckled, international law might be a bit ambitious. Start with something simpler. I smiled politely, thinking about the draft of my latest paper sitting in my laptop bag. The one analyzing the evolving landscape of international technology mergers. The paper that would be particularly relevant to the challenges he was about to face. Thank you for the advice, Mr. Preston. He patted my shoulder as he left, the gesture heavy with patronizing goodwill. I waited until his footsteps faded before pulling out my phone and making a call. Professor Martinez? The voice of David Chen, CEO of Chen Technologies, was warm with recognition. I was hoping you'd be involved in this merger. Mr. Chen, I said, my voice carrying the quiet authority I never used at the firm. We need to discuss some concerns about the technology transfer provisions in the current proposal. The next morning, I arrived early as usual, organizing the conference room for the initial client meeting. Preston strutted in at 8:55, cutting it close as always. Thompson arrived moments later, straightening his tie. At precisely 9 o'clock, David Chen walked through the door. His eyes swept the room, passing over Thompson and Preston before landing on me. His face lit up with recognition. "Professor Martinez," he exclaimed. "I had no idea you were with Harrison and Thompson. Your paper on technology transfer and international mergers was brilliant. It's actually what made me consider this deal possible in the first place." The silence in the room was absolute. I could feel Thompson and Preston staring at me, their worlds tilting on their axes. "Professor Martinez?" Thompson managed, his voice weak. I smiled, finally allowing my carefully maintained facade to drop. "Perhaps," I said, pulling out a copy of my latest paper, "we should discuss those technology transfer provisions now." The next few hours would change everything at Harrison and Thompson. But for now, I simply enjoyed the stunning silence, years of dismissed expertise and ignored potential crystallizing into a single perfect moment of revelation. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one you should have been listening to all along. And sometimes the best revenge isn't about getting even. It's about finally being seen. The conference room at Harrison and Thompson had never been so quiet. David Chen's words hung in the air like smoke, changing everything they touched. I could almost see the gears turning in Thompson's head as he desperately tried to reconcile the quiet paralegal he dismissed for years with Professor M. Blackwood, whose papers he'd cited in his own legal briefs. "Mr. Chen," Thompson finally managed, his voice struggling to maintain its usual authority, "there seems to be some confusion. Elena is one of our paralegals, not." "Actually," Chen interrupted, pulling out a legal journal from his briefcase. "Here's Professor Martinez's latest publication, Elena Martinez Blackwood, Fascinating Analysis of Technology Transfer Regulations in Cross-Border Mergers." He turned to me, eyes bright with academic interest. "Your argument about the interplay between Chinese export restrictions and U.S. intellectual property law was particularly innovative." Preston, who had been frozen in his chair, finally found his voice. But you're just a paralegal?" I finished for him, my voice carrying a confidence I kept hidden for years. "Yes, I am. I'm also an adjunct professor at Columbia Law School, a published expert in international merger law, and the person who's been quietly fixing the errors in your domestic acquisition contracts for the past 2 years." Thompson's face flushed red, whether from anger or embarrassment, I couldn't tell. "Probably both. Why didn't you ever say anything?" "I did," I replied calmly, opening my portfolio. 3 years ago, I submitted a detailed analysis of the Zhang-Anderson merger, pointing out potential complications with their technology licensing agreement. You said, and I quote, "Stick to organizing the files, dear. Leave the complex legal analysis to the professionals." I pulled out a copy of that very analysis. 6 months later, the exact issues I identified derailed the merger. The memo you dismissed could have saved the firm millions. Chen cleared his throat. "Well, I specifically requested Harrison and Thompson for this merger because I heard Professor Martinez was involved. Her expertise in navigating Chinese technology export laws is exactly what we need." He paused, looking pointedly at Thompson. "I assume she'll be leading the legal team." The next few moments were a masterclass in watching a powerful man swallow his pride. Thompson's jaw worked silently for a few seconds before he spoke. Of course. Elena will be taking point on this merger, with Preston assisting her." Preston looked like he'd swallowed something sour. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "Excellent," Chen said, standing. "Professor, shall we discuss those technology transfer provisions you mentioned?" The next few weeks were a study in organizational dynamics. Word spread quickly through the firm about my other life. Partners who had never bothered to learn my name suddenly found reasons to consult me on their international cases. Associates who used to send me on coffee runs now hovered awkwardly by my office, hoping to discuss legal theory. My office, that was another change. 3 days after the Chen meeting, I was moved from my cramped paralegal desk to a corner office on the partner's floor. Standard for our legal team leads, Thompson had mumbled, not quite meeting my eyes. The Chen-Goldman merger proceeded smoothly, though not without its challenges. The technology transfer regulations were as complex as I'd anticipated. But I'd spent years studying these exact scenarios. When Chinese regulators raised concerns about intellectual property protections, I was ready with a solution I outlined in my latest paper. Brilliant work, Chen commented during one late-night negotiation session. You know, I always wondered why such an accomplished scholar would choose to work as a paralegal. I thought about my father now recovering in a top rehabilitation facility that my dual incomes could finally afford. Sometimes life requires unexpected paths, I replied, and sometimes those paths teach us things we couldn't learn any other way. He nodded thoughtfully. Well, your practical experience certainly enhances your academic work. Your papers show a deep understanding of how these deals really work. That was true. My years at Harrison and Thompson, despite the frustrations, had given me insights no amount of pure academic research could provide. I understood the human elements, the egos and ambitions that could make or break a deal. The merger closed successfully 2 months later. $50 million, the largest international deal in the firm's history, completed without a single major hiccup. The celebration party was held in the same conference room where I'd taken notes for so many years. A toast, Thompson announced, holding up his champagne glass, to Elena Martinez Blackwood, without whom this deal would not have been possible. The words seemed to cause him physical pain, but he managed them. I accepted the toast gracefully, sipping my champagne and watching the room. Preston stood in a corner, his expression a mix of resentment and dawning respect. Sarah from the paralegal pool caught my eye and gave me a subtle thumbs up. She'd started taking night classes at law school, something I'd been quietly encouraging for months. Later that evening, Thompson called me into his office. The leather chairs that had once seemed so impressive now just looked like furniture. The board met today, he said, not quite looking at me. We'd like to offer you a partnership track position. Full credit for your years with the firm, of course. I let the offer hang in the air for a moment. And the other paralegals? Will their contributions be recognized as well? He shifted uncomfortably. Elena, that's different. You're different because I had the credentials all along. Different because the CEO recognized me, or different because you can no longer pretend not to see my value. The silence stretched between us. Finally, I pulled out a folder I prepared for this moment. I have a counter-proposal, I said, sliding it across his desk. A new department specializing in international technology mergers. I'll head it, but with a focus on mentoring and developing talent, including from our current support staff. Sarah Williams, for instance, has remarkable potential. She just needs the same opportunities I never got. Thompson opened the folder, skimming my proposal. I could see the moment he reached the part about client commitments. Several major technology firms had already expressed interest in working with my team. You've thought this through, he said finally. I've had years to think about it. He nodded slowly. I'll take it to the board. Though I suspect, he added with a hint of his old dry humor, you've already discussed this with several board members. I smiled but didn't confirm or deny. Let him wonder about all the connections I built over the years while being underestimated. The changes at Harrison and Thompson didn't happen overnight, but they happened. My department became one of the firm's most successful divisions, known for both its legal expertise and its innovative approach to developing talent. Sarah passed the bar 2 years later and became one of our most promising associates. Preston eventually got over himself and turned out to be a decent colleague once he stopped trying to prove his superiority. He even admitted, after a few drinks at a firm event, that he'd learned more in 6 months working with me than in 3 years of taking credit for others' work. As for me, I kept teaching at Columbia, but now I did it openly. My students often interned at the firm, where they learned what I had learned, that true expertise isn't about titles or corner offices. It's about the quiet dedication to understanding your craft, even when no one else sees your value. I still have my old paralegal badge framed on my office wall next to my academic publications. It reminds me of something my father used to say during his recovery. Sometimes people can't see your worth until you show them what they've been missing. The last time David Chen visited our office, he paused by that framed badge. You know, he said thoughtfully, most people would have left years ago, found somewhere that recognized their talents immediately. I looked out my office window at the young associates and paralegals working together in a collaborative space I'd insisted on creating. Sometimes, I replied, you have to stay and change things from the inside. Sometimes that's the only way to make sure others won't face the same barriers. He nodded, understanding. Well, Professor Martinez, he said with a smile, I'd say you've done exactly that. Looking back now, I realize that the greatest victory wasn't in proving Thompson wrong or in finally getting the recognition I deserved. It was in using that recognition to open doors for others, to turn a moment of personal triumph into lasting institutional change. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't about getting even or proving your worth. Sometimes it's about making sure that the next quiet professional in the corner, taking careful notes and seeing everything, won't have to wait quite so long to be heard. As I write this from my corner office, watching a new generation of legal professionals collaborate without regard for titles or hierarchies, I can't help but smile. Thompson still occasionally struggles with the changes, but even he can't deny the results. Our international technology practice has tripled in size. Our talent retention is at an all-time high, and our reputation for developing innovative legal solutions has made us the go-to firm for complex international mergers. More importantly, we haven't had a single just a paralegal comment in over 2 years, and that perhaps is the most satisfying victory of all.